First speaker here is Francesco Chiesa, and your topic is why respect is not enough.
Yes.
Now remember not to speak too fast.
Thank you. Respect is often taken to be the attitude liberal political institutions should show towards their citizens and their worldviews, no more nor less. According to this broadly defined political liberal perspective, the relations between political institutions and their citizens requires institutions adopting what Ian Carter has recently called opacity respect. It is no business of the state to express any evaluative perspective on people's ability to make autonomous choices and to develop and pursue what they consider to be worthwhile life plans. For, by taking such an evaluative stand, the state would show this respect towards people. It would treat them as patients rather than agents, patients who are potentially need or morally paid. The object of this evaluative restraint or opacity is what Carter calls agential capacities. Individual skills such as the degree of their rationality, autonomy, or dignity, however defined. Carter sees respect as reactive and a negative attitude. It is reactive because it reacts to agent as given, eschewing any problematization of the subject, and it is negative because it is given in the form of evaluative restraint, what Carter calls evaluative abstinence. So above the minimal threshold of the appropriate agential capacities, or if you prefer, autonomy or dignity, I'm not interested here in discussing what exactly is that grounds for respect. Above the threshold of the minimal agential capacities, the state has to turn its evaluative views off, or as Carter puts it, opacity kicks in. Here I argue that this account of respect, which I take to be representative of what most, especially neo-Kantian political philosophers, mean when they refer to it, I take this account of respect to be normatively insufficient in responding to many recognition claims arising from culturally and socially diverse contexts. The scope of this presentation is limited to the following three sections. I briefly define respect and esteem conceptually. I secondly argue that according to this notion of respect, treating someone respectfully is compatible with holding that is esteeming evaluative perspective on him or, and I will argue that when such coupling, respectful behavior plus this esteeming belief is held by political institutions, given the very nature of institutions, the implications are problematic. Finally, I will say that in order to compensate the arbitrary, devaluative, or evaluative stand that the state can hold without having full normative control on it, institutions should make sure that citizens live in society where they can equally compete for the relevant others' esteem, adopting an effort that goes beyond respect. So what do I mean with respect and esteem? I take respect and esteem to be two relational notions sharing the same conceptual structure. A relation between the respected or esteemer X, might be an individual, a group, or an institution, the respected and esteemed Y, some feature of Y in virtue of which Y is respected or esteemed, and some evaluative perspective from which Y is respected or esteemed. So the relation holds when X believes that Y bears a certain future, and that being that future is a good, respectful, or estimable thing from the normatively relevant evaluative perspective. Moreover, for this relation to be in place, X has to appreciate such belief and has to be disposed to behave accordingly. The distinction between the relevant evaluative perspective and the appropriate disposition or behavior is the distinction between the belief that Y should be respected and the kinds of treatment required by this belief. I want to stress this distinction between respectful belief and respectful treatment, with a kind of distinction which is crucial for the argument of this paper and which is probably, as it seems, sometimes overlooked in the literature. So given that respect and esteem share this conceptual structure, the fundamental difference between them is given by the evaluative perspective that makes Y's relevant future respectful or estimable. Respect in its broadly defined Kantian account is equally due to everyone by virtue of everyone sharing some feature, a certain account of agency, of dignity or autonomy, and merely being a person is the origin of the right to respect, is the self-authenticated source of valid claims, as Rawls put it, facing us from a position of second personal authority in Stephen Darwell parlance, As Darwin observes, strictly speaking, the object of this conception of respect is a fact. The fact of others being persons, which, if adequately regarded, defines its moral scope negatively by restricting the class of actions which are morally permissible towards persons. This account of recognition as equal respect does not in principle require evaluating people's reasons and wants. Respect is responsive, reactive, through constraining one's behavior to the fact of them being persons sharing a certain feature, whatever their particular reasons and merits are, assuming these agents are above the threshold. Conversely, in the realm of esteem, individuals or groups are not self-authenticating source of valid claims, but claims, if they are to be esteemed, need to be socially recognized. In this case, the individual's claims depend on the relevant other's validation in a more fundamental way. Thus, esteem requires a different attitude than respect. It is not the negative response by restricting what counts as permissible action or regard to a fact, but a positive response to a person and her features. Respect and esteem, so defined then, tell us about two different ways persons relate to the significant others, including institutional bodies. Two different ways of looking others in the eyes, with different aims and looking for different responses. In the realm of respect, X looks Y in the eyes in order to establish herself as Y's equal, and Y respects X through a negative response, restraint, by restricting what counts as permissible action or regard. While in the realm of esteem, X looks Y in the eyes in order to gain validation of some sort from Y. This validation process is a positive response, not restraint, which contribute as constitutive power to the identity formation process. So in the light of the foregoing accounts of respect and esteem, I now claim that disposition behavior following from respect is compatible with holding existing beliefs, that especially when held by the state can be socially expressed in terms of what counts as valuable and estimable in a given society. Such compatibility is due to the fact that the restraint which should bind respectful political institutions seems to apply necessarily to the sort of behavioral dispositions rather than to the evaluative perspective itself. This must be so unless one adopts the controversial view of doxastic voluntarism, that is the view that human agents and their aggregates, including political institutions, have the capacity to uphold the beliefs they fully voluntarily choose to have, including the capacity of restraining themselves from having a certain evaluative perspective on why. Doxastic voluntarism holds the view that agents can adopt and reject beliefs at will, in the same sense as I can move my beams at will. Hence, if X does not have the beliefs required for respect, X is simply obliged to adopt that belief. As some have argued, our doxastic dimensions, our beliefs, are not under our full control, and being obligated to adopt a certain belief would mean being obligated to do something we are incapable of doing. If we maintain the venerable principle that ought implies can, then X has no obligation that exceed her capacities. X has no obligations to hold respectful beliefs on Y if X lacks such belief, while X may well have the obligation to treat Y respectfully, even if X would spontaneously lack the appropriate disposition, because the behavior, contrary to the belief, seems to be fully at the disposition of agent's will. If this is correct, we could prescribe behavioral abstinence, but not what Carter calls evaluative abstinence. I'm assuming here that even deciding to abstain oneself from forming an evaluative position on something is holding an evaluative position of belief. In other words, evaluative abstinence can hardly be presented as a lack of evaluation, is a particular form of it. This is so because here we are dealing with an intentional and normative account of evaluative abstinence. Me, with respect to Y, prescribes me to abstain from evaluating Y's free personal choices. My point is that such prescription is impossible and thus normatively unwarrantable. Say, for example, X is an examining doctor involved in a research therapy project, and Y is one of the participants involved in the clinical trial. Y, as all the participants in these sorts of research trials, had to sign a declaration stating that he can withdraw the research at any time without having to give any reason and without having to fear disrespect on reprisals from X, from the doctor. Although in doing so, the participant may cause many inconveniences to the examining doctor and undermine the research project. Suppose Y does withdraw with no reason, he does not have to give reasons, from the project. In this case, the incomprehensibility of the reasons for the action of the participants which affect the doctor is no reason for denying this person respect. As we said in the, this kind of Kantian account of respect, above the threshold, respect given unconditionally in respect to any kind of reasons merits at once. Bearing in mind this example, think that the same doctor may be due to respect the renunciation of some life-saving measures by members of a certain religion, even if this makes what the doctor sees as his obligation of appropriate medical therapy impossible. In both these cases, it is easy to imagine the doctor behaving respectfully with the participant withdrawing from the clinical trial and with the patient renouncing to life-saving medical treatment, while at the same time holding a disesteeming evaluative perspective on the choices of both. The doctor treats them respectfully if he accepts their choices without openly questioning them in a patronizing way, if he treats them as moral agents and not as patients in need of moral repair. The doctor, at the same time, may hold his esteeming beliefs if he thinks, for whatever reason, that their choices were wrong and or undesirable. He does not only think he would not pursue those choices if he was in the same circumstances, he despises those two particular persons who have taken those choices. However, he fully respects them, behaviorally and attitudinally, he fully respects them. So, I argue that when this kind of coupling between respectful behavior and holding the valuing beliefs or existing beliefs happen to be held by an individual, even if in this case we may say it's a special kind of individual because assuming he works in a public hospital in a country having a public system, it somehow symbolizes kind of some kind of state activity. But when such coupling, respectful behavior and existing beliefs is held by an individual, we can assume easily that this coupling won't have any consequences, or the consequences will be absent or negligible. So we can assume that the participants withdrawing the clinical trial and the religious patient renouncing life-saving measures won't experience nothing else than respect from the doctor. But when the same coupling, respectful behavior and existing beliefs, is held not only by individuals but by overall political institutions, by overall respectful behaving political institutions, given the very nature of institutions, the implications of such valuing stance seems to be particularly problematic. Because I cannot provide here a kind of account of institutions. Of course, here I have in mind the historicist, non-ideal account of political institutions. So even when political institutions gain liberal legitimacy by accommodating pluralism and diversity, they are always the outcome of certain constitutional history of particular political cultures, long-standing customs, and sedimented social practices dominated by certain political and economic elite. So our political institutions that maybe in the recent or not recent past were to a certain degree sexist or racist or confessional, and such past-rooted tendencies will unavoidably have various impacts on institutions present expressing stand. When overall political institutions hold such coupling, respectful behavior plus existing belief, such a devaluing stand can be de facto expressed and perceived by society's members in a way that may have an impact on what praxis, cultures, and beliefs are considered to be legitimate, valuable, desirable, or undesirable. It seems probable in principle and likely in practice that X can treat Y respectfully without doing so out of the appropriate, respectful, evaluative beliefs, restraint or opacity. X can treat Y respectfully as if X had the relevant belief, although in fact X lacks it. For example, assume that the relevant future grounding respect is a standard notion of autonomy, that X happens to be a strongly secular state. It happens to be a strongly secular state when also probably a legitimate liberal democratic country, and it happens to be a strongly secular state for historical reasons and constitutional reasons. We can think of France, for example. It happens to be a strongly secular state, and Y is a deeply religious person who spends most of our time praying and trying to make proselitities. X can treat Y respectfully out of hypocrisy or for strategic interest-based reason, for example, because the state wants to conform to the international human rights treaties which confer a special status to religion in order not to jeopardize the business relations it has with the confessional religious state from which Y comes from. X can treat Y respectfully without holding any respectful convictions about Y. It does not see herself as being morally bound to evaluative axioms towards Y, because X appeals toward the belief that religious persons of that sort are not fully autonomous agents, and this is so because, say, autonomy requires a certain account of rationality, which is seen by X as being at odds with holding religious beliefs. That X holds such distinct beliefs seems to be compatible with respectful treatment, such as full equal treatment under the law. I want to clarify here something that wasn't clear in the paper. This is not an argument against opacity respect as a conceptual principle. Opacity respect is well equipped to acknowledge the rejection of doxastic voluntarism, which is the view that agents cannot adopt beliefs at will, because it can easily argue that what the agents shouldn't do is, even if there is these existing beliefs, is just deciding not to making them count in the way they behave and what they say. Is rather an argument in the idea that opacity respect is a sufficient, not on the conceptual account of opacity respect, but on the normative argument that sees opacity respect as a sufficient normative obligation that political institutions should owe to their citizens and their worldviews. So, if this is correct, that doxastic voluntarism is an untenable epistemological position, then as said above, an agent X may well find herself in the position of esteeming Y and at the same time respecting Y through restraining herself from all arbitrary actions. Consider again the secularist state, which through its constitutions, laws, public policies, and speeches, de facto expresses its esteeming evaluation of religion. It lacks respectful belief and cannot adopt it at will. But at the same time, the state adopts appropriate behaviors through restraint towards its religious citizens. Although the state adopts the appropriate restraint towards Y, the fact that it happens towards a disesteeming belief of Y's identity will have an impact in the society where Y lives. Those religious citizens will live in a society in which, although they are respected according to this notion of respect, their religious identity as such is disesteemed. The state can give a set of rights to a certain group which satisfies the requirement of respect while still despising what they do. Even when the state behaves respectfully, the state's valuing beliefs can take place through symbolic behaviors, through what Axelonet called institutionalized hierarchies of values, or what Stephen Hughes called rituals, which help to define as authoritative certain ways of seeing society and to specify what in society is of special significance by drawing people's attention to certain forms of relationships and activity. Social and political esteem or disesteem confers legitimacy to what counts as valuable and estimable or disestimable in a given society. It concerns concrete traits and abilities such as ethnicity, culture, gender, work, class, and how individuals are able to relate positively to these traits and abilities in the society where they live. Different societies have different ways in which esteem and disesteem are conveyed, often not in a formally codified way. Through, for example, the expressive function of their criminal law and public policies. Public policies send messages, are expressivist. So, for example, for laws which articulate the community's moral condemnation of certain conducts and practices, think of social welfare policies that implicitly stigmatize people on benefit, or think of the cultural expressivist function of school curriculum, which obviously include and exclude certain cultural heritage, or the cultural expressivist function of public holidays in post-Christian secular countries, when Sundays and Christmas happen to be days off from school and work. Or the ways in which certain activities happen to be or not to be recognized as work, such as caregiving and upbringing, or how different professions are ordered in social status hierarchy. The empirical consideration behind what I'm saying here is that the cultural evaluations or beliefs held by institutions translate into the public and social culture of the society, legitimizing certain social norms and delegitimizing others. A society where people can be esteemed for what they are is a society in which guarantees that people can view one another in light of values that allow the abilities and traits of the other to appear significant for shared praxis. So an individual experiences his traits, abilities, and achievements and those of the group he is part of as worthy contribution to the entire society. Minorities invoke recognition not only in order not to be discriminated against, but also to assert their valuable status, for example, by practicing and promoting their language or celebrating their cultural traditions by festivals or by contributing to the drawing up of the school curriculum in the society where they are part of. Asserting their valuable status is a way of seeking to make their identities, traits, and achievements become part of those patterns of value and shared practices which define a society in the mainstream. To be sure, there are groups such as the Amish who seem disinterested in contributing to the shaping of mainstream value partners, and simply ask to be left alone. But I think that the great majority of recognition claims are claims driven from the desire to count in defining what matters in a given society, to contribute to its common tangible and intangible heritage. This entails the requirement of living under institutions which are expressing a particular attitude towards people's specific cultural tradition. It is only through being socialized, this is a kind of Joseph Fra's argument, in a culture whose shared meanings and common practices one has contributed to form, and that to a certain degree embraces, that one can have real access to what she considers meaningful options among which to choose for pursuing what she considers to be a worthwhile life. So, considering the devaluing stand and its implications that political institutions can assume, despite of them behaving respectfully, I think that political institutions are required to adopt an effort that goes beyond respect. They should provide to people the conditions that make gaining the relevant others' esteem in the society where they live an equally valuable opportunity for all. Does it make any sense asking the political power, and the state in particular, to be in charge of this sort of recognition? Can the state supply or withhold esteem? The answer seems to be negative, considering that esteem is an evaluative notion grounded in genuine beliefs, which cannot be the outcome of mere choice, beliefs that cannot be intentionally or voluntarily supplied. Esteem just happens to be wrong from us in the presence of the relevant normative future. It wouldn't make any sense that you say someone, I'm deciding now I'm going to make an effort to esteem you, because esteem would completely miss its value of being a genuine reaction to something he represented or he did. Of course, then, the rejection of the exhausting voluntarism applies to esteem in the same way it applies to respect, as explained before. However, I argue that although the state cannot just choose to bestow esteem, it can provide esteem's marks or services that work as proxies of esteem or disesteem, as argued by Crawford and Brennan and Petit. Esteem channels making the possibility of competing for others' esteem a viable option for all, a kind of currency of esteem. These esteem services can be described as acts, voluntary acts, and or dispositions towards Y, which may raise the probability of Y's enjoying esteem or suffering disesteem. Thus, though X cannot voluntarily confer or withhold esteem, X can confer or withhold certain esteem marks or services which function as credible conduits of esteem. Brennan and Petit distinguish three such services that one can voluntarily provide and to which esteem can be indirectly provided: attention, testimony, and association-dissociation. To give attention to someone's traits, abilities, and achievement is an obvious precondition of possible conferment of esteem or disesteem. Deciding to express one's thoughts and attitude about someone and his performance, testifying whether these opinions are real or simulated, may contribute to the phenomenon of informational reputational cascades. The third esteem service of association can work as a proxy of esteem's exchange or transmission. X can associate herself with Y in a way that reflects the esteem or disesteem that others give to X into Y, or X can dissociate herself from Y in a way that stops such reflection. So if the legitimate political power publicly identifies with and includes it or associates with its citizenship constituency certain socially, culturally, sexually diverse groups, by, for example, inviting them to contribute to the drawing up of the school curriculum or to the decoration of the public space, then the political power confers to them a certain status of power, an esteem mark that put them in the condition of winning others' esteem. And conversely, if the state dissociates itself from certain traits, for example, by implying in its constitution that being gay runs against society's natural reproduction, or by de facto outlawing with its property and public orders laws the very possibility of being a traveler and pursuing a nomadic lifestyle, If it does that, it denies certain people any share of the constituency sharing that status. It disowns them of that much of esteem that makes the possibility of winning others' esteem and better positioning themselves in the esteem market much less viable. So one way the state can implement these services or proxies is through what Corey Brett-Schneider has recently called state's expressive powers, or the non-coercive functions of the state, such as its ability to influence society's patterns or values, shared practices, and beliefs by speaking, educating, and spending. For example, through its subsidized power, it is, for example, its ability to grant and withdraw tax-exempt and tax-deducible non-profit status to certain organizations and not others. One may say that arguing that political institutions should provide these esteem channels is a matter beyond justice and duty. That is to say that it does not really represent any sort of obligation for institutions, not obligations with not corresponding citizens' rights. Such an expressive state may be just ranked well under some account of what makes political institutions virtuous in the pursuit of some account of excellence. What political institutions, as the objection goes, what political institutions should avoid is injury and discrimination, not indifference or disesteem. For in doing so, political institutions would act in a supererogatory manner at best, in an intrusive, illiberal way at worst. Here I cannot fully explain why I think such sort of criticism fails to be sound. Let me just sketch out two provisional possible strategies to this criticism. One response aims to problematize the distinction between justice and virtue as neither necessary nor plausible, and argues, following Honor O'Neill, in favor of an integrated account of justice and virtue, especially through a defense of the plausibility of imperfect obligations, so those obligations which come without counterpart rights. The implication of this is that what are usually presented as virtuous actions may be morally required and at the same time unclaimable, quoting O'Neill, unwaivable and not really enforceable by the conventional methods through which claimable obligations are often enforced, end quote. The second response strategy, alternative to the first one, aims to argue that even if we take justice to be a matter of perfect obligation, the sort of vulnerabilities caused by living in a society where one's identity traits, one's skills and achievements do not constitute part of the shared horizon of values are severe vulnerabilities which can impair one's self-respect. Taking self-respect to be a moral psychological condition of agency, in the sense of being able to self-realize oneself in choosing and pursuing what one considers to be worthwhile activities and relationships, such impairment would count as an injury calling for justice